Welcome back to Philosophy for a Small Planet. In this video, I'm going to talk about the power of melodrama to change the world. If you watched my last video, you'll know that I talked about The Melodramatic Imagination, this book by Peter Brooks that introduced me to the concept of melodrama. If you haven't watched that video, I'll put a link up here somewhere, but I'll also give you a brief summary right now. Melodrama is a mode of storytelling that features a central conflict between a hero and a villain that is resolved by the villain being eliminated at the end. There's often an innocent victim who is a paragon of virtue, and sometimes that is the heroine herself, or sometimes there's some active male hero usually who comes in to rescue the female victim. This is the paradigm of storytelling that we're most used to in American culture these days. This is what Hollywood uses most of the time. This is Harry Potter, this is Lord of the Rings, this is Star Wars, this is Marvel, and it also, as you might immediately think of when you hear the term melodrama, features heightened expressions of emotion and of moral meaning. So in melodrama, especially, according to Peter Brooks, the moral occult, or the layer of moral meaning underneath actions and underneath the world, is brought to the surface. In this video, I'm going to talk about how melodrama has been used to have enormous impacts on history and on society. I'd like you to guess, what American novel sold the most copies in the 19th century, in the 1800s? This book sold more copies than any other book besides the Bible. It was turned into traveling theater plays that traveled around the country and put on performances based on this book. It had an enormous historical impact. So I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can guess which book it is. The book I'm talking about is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Abraham Lincoln is purported to have said, it's probably apocryphal, probably didn't really happen, but when Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, which did happen, Abraham Lincoln was reported to have said, "So this is the little woman who started this great war." And Senator Charles Sumner did say that if there had been no Uncle Tom's Cabin, there would be no Lincoln in the White House. This book had a huge impact on how especially white Americans viewed the institution of slavery. And it was really written in response to the passage of the fugitive slave law that required Northerners to return fugitive slaves to the South. So Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book to talk about the conditions of slavery and what that meant. This book is highly melodramatic and also has come under a lot of valid criticism, but you cannot deny the powerful effect that it had on audiences. So how did it achieve this effect? Well, remember how I was talking about the passive virtuous victim? That's Uncle Tom. So one of the reasons that Uncle Tom's Cabin has come under criticism, and even the current use of the term Uncle Tom, is used to mean a black person who is accommodating to white people or overly solicitous to white people to the detriment of other black people. And that is definitely an apt description of Uncle Tom. He is a character who is kind of a paragon of what Stowe considers to be the Christian virtues. So that whole passage about turn the other cheek, where Jesus says, if somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other cheek so he may strike you there also. So that's a pretty convenient message to give to slaves if you're a slave owner. And this is kind of the approach that Uncle Tom takes to life. He has complete faith in his Lord Jesus Christ, and that Jesus has put him where he is for a reason. And so when Tom gets sold from his rather kind and benign master to a slave trader to be taken south, he just passively goes along with it. And that works out for him for a while. He gets sold to another master who is also pretty benign. That's another valid reason to criticize this book. There's a lot of benign slaveholders in this book, and it definitely romanticizes the institution of slavery while it's also criticizing it heavily. But Stowe really makes her point when Tom's second master dies and he is sold to the vicious Simon Legree, who buys Tom to be an overseer of other slaves, but Tom refuses to whip other slaves, and so Simon has him whipped until he dies. Tom's only real act of disobedience throughout the whole story is that he refuses to beat or whip other slaves, and he also refuses to give up the location of 2 slaves who escaped Simon Legree. And so for that, he gets beaten to death. But other than that, he always is perfectly obedient and loyal. What Tom is definitely not is a role model for Black people in America. But we can understand Tom's function a lot better when we understand melodrama. Tom's function is to be the passive, virtuous victim who is so virtuous that he is not even willing to stand up for himself, only to stand up for other people, and not to do so violently or resist in any way. And so he displays this complete, perfect virtue throughout the whole story. We might debate whether it's virtuous, but in the paradigm that Stowe is writing in, it's perfect virtue. And for that virtue, he is brutally beaten to death. So this arouses the sympathy of the white audience. But by contrast, there's another set of characters in this novel who take the role of the active hero. At the same time that Tom is sold, another slave from the same plantation, Eliza, has a son who is also sold to the same slave trader. Eliza does not go passively. She decides to escape and bring her son with her. And so does her husband, George Harris. So Eliza and George and Eliza's son, Henry, all escape and eventually make their way to the north, and then to Canada, and then to Africa. Stowe is not 100% saying that, being like Tom is the way you should be. She is saying that in an ideal world, we should all be like Tom, but under the system of slavery, being like Tom gets you killed. So the point she's trying to make is that perfect Christian virtue is not compatible with the system of slavery. And so George Harris, who a couple times in the story has to be talked down from killing his master or fighting and killing white people who are trying to capture him, he's a much more fiery kind of an individual. And while, Stowe puts in some criticisms of that, he's the one who actually gets out. He and his wife, Eliza, and their son. The reason I'm talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin is because of another book, Playing the Race Card by Linda Williams, which is a brilliant book that talks about what she calls American racial melodrama, where she kind of lays out a narrative of how melodrama has shaped the American attitude toward race through history. Linda Williams contrasts the Uncle Tom narrative of the white male villain and the black male victim with what she calls the anti-Tom narrative, which was really inaugurated by D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which, if you know about film history, it was a 1915 film that is one of the films that inaugurated the form of Hollywood narrative cinema that we still have today. In the early film, they still weren't sure what to do with this new medium. There was all kinds of weird stuff that they made. Thomas Edison made short films of elephants being electrocuted, like WTF. D.W. Griffith was one of the people who figured out how to use film to tell stories in this long form, 2 to 3 hour narrative feature format. He invented a lot of the forms of Hollywood storytelling that are still used today. And one of the films with which he did that was The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is a movie where the KKK are the good guys. Yep. The KKK had been created in the times of Reconstruction, after the Civil War and in the post-Reconstruction era, and had actually died down drastically by 1915. But The Birth of a Nation revived the KKK all across the country. Membership soared. So this film also had a tremendous impact on race relations in the United States, and not for the better. But it uses the same melodramatic form that Uncle Tom does. It's just reversed. In The Birth of a Nation, it's not the white male villain and the black male victim. It is the black male villain and the white female victim. Content warning. The following sequence contains blackface, the threat of rape, and extremely racist imagery. If you don't want to see that right now, skip to 12:06 in this video. The canonical chase sequence in The Birth of a Nation features the KKK, the newly created KKK, in their white robes, on their white horses, sweeping all of these mobs of black people off of the screen, literally whitewashing the screen. The final chase sequence has white men and their wives trapped in a cabin, surrounded by black men trying to get in to rape the white men's wives. And the white men are holding pistols to their wives' heads to prevent them from having to endure this indignity. It's cutting back and forth between this scene in the cabin and the KKK men on their white horses sweeping through the town. And will they get there in time? And then, of course, they do right at the last minute as the mob is pushing its way into the cabin. The men on their horses come and they shoot all the black people and save the white women. And it's incredibly disturbing to watch this scene, not just because of what's in the scene and what's happening, but because it is very difficult not to feel some part of you rooting for the KKK as you watch this scene. Now, I am not saying that the KKK are good. The KKK are bad. But this movie did a really good job of making them seem like the good guys of that era of history. And that is the power of melodrama. The power of melodrama is that you can put whoever you want in the good guy place and whoever you want in the bad guy place, and people who watch that movie are going to root for the good guys and hate the bad guys. So this is why, to tie back to my previous video, I'm not a big fan of melodrama. I do not think the good guy, bad guy paradigm is very good for us. Are there times where a melodramatic approach is the best one? Yes. So take, for example, The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, I have issues with The Lord of the Rings because it enshrined this stark melodrama as the basic story of all fantasy. In fact, if you watch the scene in The Two Towers where Gandalf comes to rescue the characters trapped at Helm's Deep, it's disturbingly reminiscent of the final chase sequence in Birth of a Nation. You have these innocent characters trapped inside of, in this case, a fortress, and this horde of black orcs battering down the entrance. And Gandalf comes on his white horse and sweeps the orcs off the screen. The orcs are portrayed as subhuman, as beneath our empathy or concern. And this is the fundamental template of melodrama that The Lord of the Rings initiated, that became the basic format for fantasy stories for many, many years. Some people have recently started to write fantasy stories that don't work this way, but so many fantasy stories are written with the template of plucky young hero defeats evil dark lord of evil, whose only characteristic is that they are evil. And this is certainly what The Lord of the Rings is. Sauron has no nuance. He has no characteristics. He has no personality. He is just the Dark Lord, whose only goal is to spread as much darkness as he can, as far as he can, as fast as he can. Why he would want to do this? Meh. Power, I guess. But if you look at when Tolkien was writing this, Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings in 1936. What else was going on in 1936? Well, fascism was taking over Europe, is what was going on in 1936. And what was Tolkien's country, the UK, doing about it? Nothing. At that time, Great Britain and France and the US were all pursuing a policy of appeasement toward Hitler. Hitler started building up his military in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Well, let's just let him have what he wants, and maybe we won't have to fight another world war. Hitler annexed Austria. Well, maybe that will appease him, and we won't have to have another world war. Hitler marches into the Sudetenland, the German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia. Well, maybe that will appease him, and we won't have to have another world war. It wasn't until Germany invaded Poland in 1939 that the Allies finally got off their butts and did something about it. If they had intervened earlier when he began violating the terms of the treaty, then they might have been able to defeat him fairly easily. But by the time they did start fighting, he had built up a military juggernaut that then took over almost all of Europe before finally being defeated, and in the process murdered 6 million Jews and 10 or 12 million people total. So yeah, sometimes somebody's just bad or close enough that it doesn't really matter. And that's kind of the case with Sauron in Lord of the Rings. Like, anybody who tries to work with Sauron or accommodate his armies or somehow come to some kind of compromise or deal just gets corrupted and destroyed. Only the people who have no other solution to Sauron but war, those are the people who are right. And with Hitler, that turned out to be the right response. So yes, there are times when a melodramatic paradigm is the one that fits the situation the best. The irony, of course, is that Hitler had a very melodramatic paradigm. The Jews are the insidious evil that is undermining Germany and undermining Europe, and the only thing we can do about them is get rid of them all. There's no way that Jews can be assimilated into what he considered to be the right kind of society, the German one. They just have to be killed. So melodrama begets melodrama. But there's no other paradigm that the Allies could have used that would have been the appropriate response to that situation, at least not one I can think of. Am I saying that we should never tell melodramatic stories with good guys and bad guys? No. But I think it's a problem that the vast majority of the stories that we tell work this way. Perhaps there was a time when the biggest threat to any person was some other group of people out there, where the most adaptive thing a group of people could do is convince themselves that some other group of people were the bad guys and needed to be defeated. And there have been times, for sure, when some group of people got some up idea in their head and turned into bad guys for some period of time. The Nazis, the KKK, those are good examples. But if you look at the world today, the biggest threats we face are not another group of people. The biggest threats we face: mass extinction, climate change, are global issues that have to be solved with global cooperation. So again, am I saying that we should never tell good guy, bad guy stories, that we should never use the melodramatic narrative structure? No, I'm not saying that. But I also want to put a link here to a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. This is by an African author who talks about why we should have many different stories, many different ways that we talk about things, many different narrative paradigms in our minds, because the world is complex. It doesn't always follow one paradigm or one structure or one narrative. And so what I'm saying is we need to have many different narratives, and especially right now, given the challenges that we're facing and given the need for collaborating across differences, we need to have stories that celebrate that.